Hi everyone, this is Sam Black, and today I wanted to take an opportunity to clarify some tweets of mine that got a lot of traction and response from the Commander community and kind of expand on what I was talking about and what I would recommend for mana in Commander. For those of you who are new to my content, I want to just give a little bit of background. Hi, I'm Sam Black. I have been playing Magic professionally since 2007-ish. I'm the current host of my own podcast, Drafting Archetypes, a podcast that talks about how to draft a different archetype every week in the current limited format, and I regularly stream limited. I'm known from my professional career and writing for Star City Games for 15-ish years. And so a lot of people perceive me as having a background that's biased by familiarity with 60-card competitive Magic. So I want to clarify that I've been playing Magic since '94, so I played for over a decade before ever qualifying for the Pro Tour, and during that time played primarily casual multiplayer. I also just love playing paper Magic, and basically take any opportunity to play paper Magic. So I've played a healthy amount of casual and Commander throughout my time with Magic, and then most recently I've been drafting a Commander cube that I made multiple times per week, as well as playing Commander pretty regularly for the last few months. So I do have context for multiplayer and the factors that go into those games and what matters there. I think that a lot of responses from the Commander audience assume when I say something that they disagree with that it should be dismissed as coming from a lack of familiarity, because I think that it's an attempt to simultaneously respect my understanding of Magic as a whole while not really being fully open to the ideas that I'm getting at. So kind of a way to protect what someone already thinks while not diminishing my kind of like credentials. But I think that basically I just want to say, like, I am speaking from experience, and so I think the conversations are useful if you try to understand where I'm coming from, what I'm getting at, how I think multiplayer functions strategically. Basically, I think that what I'm getting at is kind of maybe based on a way that I play and certain biases that I have about playing multiplayer, but they're not coming from a lack of familiarity with multiplayer. And so I think the conversation gets more interesting and gets like to a higher level if people engage with my ideas as they're intended rather than dismissing them as not knowing what we're talking about. So, my tweets. I have the thread pulled up over here. This is responding to someone who said, we're going to need some elaboration on this. Not saying you're wrong, but I've only ever heard idiots say this, not people who are actually good at Magic. My interest is piqued about my saying that mana rocks were overrated. So if I'm going to answer this, I need to do it in its own thread to minimize repeating it. Mana rocks are a scam in Commander. So let me just fully acknowledge our scam was bombastic language that was kind of intended mostly jokingly, but also to some extent, clickbait type, like generate engagement, more jarring language. I think mana rocks are overplayed. I think they're used as a default in a lot of decks that they don't belong in. I don't think you should never play them. Also, I want to clarify that when I say mana rocks in this context, I'm specifically referring to artifacts that cost 2 or 3 mana and tap for 1 mana. I understand that there are a lot of players who use the phrase to refer to any artifact that can add mana. I don't want to get into which of these is correct, which any particular community uses. I might have used the term in a way that is incorrect or less popular than other uses, but what I am referring to, regardless of whether I'm referring to it correctly, is specifically, talismans, signets, monolith type mana rocks, as opposed to, soul rings and moxes and mana vault, grim monolith, and all that kind of stuff. So my first follow-up point: people don't play enough land. I think the precons WotC are about 3 to 5 lands short of where they should be. People justify not playing enough lands by playing rocks, but if you spend a turn playing a rock, then miss a land drop, it's really bad. So 3 to 5 lands short in the precons is, compared to the community at large, a radical stance. I acknowledge that. I think that there are a lot of content creators who suggest that people don't play enough lands while still playing significantly fewer lands than I would recommend. So we're like multiple levels of disagreement apart from each other, me compared to kind of the aggregate community. Yeah, we are. There's not really another way to put that. I think that people are way off here. And I hope to explain and unpack that in the rest of this video. So to give those decks that I'm referring to play, I think, like 37 or 38 lands usually. I think they should be playing, 41 to 43 kind of range. My next tweet: it's much worse than you think, because that early mana could have been on something that's generating value over time, and more importantly, the rocks are fragile. Losing mana at any point in the game is horrible. And I'm just going to link this in with the next tweet. If you play creatures on turns 2 and 3 instead, you can be building synergies and generating political board presence. So these tweets have got some responses that are reasonable. Like, I'm suggesting that you should spend mana on something other than rocks instead of spending mana on rocks. And I'm saying that the rocks are fragile. And there's a reasonable reply that while it is true that it's not hard to destroy an artifact, their rocks are very rarely the target of targeted removal, which I agree with. And there are more sweepers played that clear creatures than there are that clear artifacts. So it can seem counterintuitive that I would suggest spending mana on something that is more likely to get killed rather than something less likely to get killed in the name of resilience. And I think that creatures do a very wide variety of things and generate a wide variety of kinds of value. And they can be chosen for different sorts of goals depending on what your deck is. And their fragility can be hedged against in a variety of ways. So, for example, if you play any 2-mana creature instead of playing a rock on 2, and then on turn 3 you play like a Midnight Reaper instead of playing a mana rock, and then your opponent plays a sweeper because you're starting to build this board presence, you will draw 2 cards, whereas the mana rocks outside of a few of them, don't draw cards when they're killed. So you can play creatures that offer you some kind of insurance. You can play creatures that draw a card when you play them, like Elvish Visionary or Wall of Omens or whatever. The counter argument there is, well, Elvish Visionary doesn't do anything. It's just like, the 1/1 has no impact in a commander. And while I'm not going to argue that a 1/1 is a significant threat in a game of Commander, it can be the basis for other synergies. You can have things that care about your creature count, that flicker your creatures, that scale your creatures, and you can also just, if you have this body in play, your opponent might not attack you with their first large ground creature because you can chump block with this creature that you can't put into play, and that's less profitable for them than attacking someone else might be. So you're not necessarily more exposed, and you're like building toward other things, ideally. A lot of this is simply that having a creature in play nets you some amount of damage, saves you some amount of life, especially if other people are also playing creatures, and you can negotiate about where attacks are happening. And so I think also that like when a sweeper is played is a function of how many creatures are played. And so like whether you want to be the person who's contributing to the board to get to the point where it's correct for a sweeper to be played kind of depends on your creature density and your overall strategy. All of this needs to be considered in terms of like how much presence, how much threat density, but like not by density, I mean like how much. I guess this could be viewed in terms of I forget the term in like multiplayer games, drawing aggro. How much aggro you want to draw in terms of the ire of your opponents, or how much you want to increase their threat assessment of you. So how threatening do you want to appear? And are you trying to tip the scales to the point where you feel like someone has to use an answer to get them to use the answer? Or are you trying to, not draw out that answer until someone else does something over the top of what you're doing to draw out that answer? And I think having kind of these like lower impact creatures is a good way to be able to participate in kind of like negotiations about what's happening on the board without becoming the archenemy, without being seen as the primary threat and demanding a response. I think that so kind of there's this whole discussion about what's the strongest thing you can be doing that I think kind of is anytime you talk about here's how to make a deck better, the assessment is, or the expectation is that your goal is to make the deck stronger in kind of a just like, what is your total ability to exert influence on a game in a way that doesn't highly prioritize, well, maybe you don't want to be the most threatening. And so part of optimizing for winning a multiplayer game is going to come down to choosing your role in terms of the table's threat assessment. Are you trying to come out hard and heavy and overwhelm everyone else? Or are you afraid of flying too close to the sun, where you do something faster and bigger than the other players that makes them come up on you, and then you can't handle that and you get taken down, or you do something where you play a permanent that's very powerful and hard to deal with, and threatening to the other players, they don't have a way to destroy it, and so their only way to remove it from the game is to kill you, and you force them to kill you before they otherwise might have, to answer this uh, thing that they don't want to have in play anymore. So and this, I guess I'm segueing into my next point. Even more importantly, fragile ramping isn't that strong because the payoff is that you're first to do the most threatening thing, but that means it's most likely to be answered because people haven't had a chance to use their answers. So my expectation is, some of the table will have like a Swords to Plowshares type card, and the person who has the Swords to Plowshares type card is going to have a threshold about how threatening does a thing need to be for me to want to use this Swords to Plowshares to kill it. And if you imagine that threshold is, well, I would kill a 5-mana creature, but I wouldn't kill most 4-mana creatures, then if you ramp and you're the first person to meet that threshold to play a 5-mana creature, then they use the Swords to Plowshares and kill it, and you're down a card and they're down a card, and that's bad for both of you and good for everyone else. Now, in reality, I think that Swords to Plowshares is probably very often going to be used diplomatically and politically, and you can play a 5-mana creature and your opponent can say, like, I'm going to kill that if it attacks me. Maybe it should attack someone else, and I can be happy that it's there. How that kind of thing goes, whether those discussions happen, very much are going to vary from table to table in terms of the player's tolerance for politics and diplomacy and negotiations and deals. And it's hard to speak to all possible permutations of how games are played politically. But in general, so basically there's part of assessing what you should be trying to do to win a table involves understanding which resources matter at that table and how threat assessment is calculated at that table. So I think that most resources in a game of Commander are extremely fluid. It's very easy to go from really far out on board with like a lot of creatures and stuff to having all of that destroyed by a single spell and then being behind whatever, advantage that represented. Then there's just this question about, well, like, what resources are stickiest? What kind of advantage can I generate that actually matters and isn't like ephemeral and won't just go away the next time someone does a thing that someone's going to do at some point in this game? So if your game involves players playing with a lot of Wheel of Fortune type effects, then generating cards in your hand is not a very sticky resource. But if it doesn't, then cards in hand might be a very sticky resource. Similarly, some games, life total is extremely important. Life total can be a resource that doesn't change, doesn't get reset by like sweepers and stuff, and it can and therefore like playing creatures early to affect life total can put you in a significantly better position where you have life to work with. You can afford to take a hit. You can use that as a resource in various ways. Whereas if your life total is low and you do anything too threatening, then someone can easily kill you. And so you need to like be careful to never be too threatening if your life total is low, whereas if your life total is higher, you can maybe afford to be threatening in a way that lets you scale up to go over the top of everyone to actually win the game without just getting punished by some attackers and getting removed from the game before you win. However, there are other tables where life total doesn't matter. If everyone's playing some kind of combo deck, Thassa's Oracle Kill, something that goes way, way over the top, any infinite combo, if your games generally end in that way, in a way that's totally life total agnostic, you might think, well, creatures and life total and damage over like a few turns, none of that impacts the end of the game, so it's not a relevant resource. And so, like, which resources matter for your deck and at your table can certainly vary. You might play a combo deck where your general belief is that life total doesn't matter, but then if you play at a table that plays a lot of like counter spells and hate bears and things that stop your combo from functioning, you can find yourself forced into kind of a scrappier game. Life total does matter. So it's a function of both your deck and your table, like which resources matter. My belief is that in aggregate, in most games of Commander, in most communities of Commander players, lands are a relatively sacred resource. That is, say that things that destroy your lands and reset an advantage that you have in terms of having made land drops are very rare. And so I find that simply playing a land every turn is one of the most powerful things you can do in Commander, because other advantages are ephemeral in a way that playing lands is not. So to me, I want to be playing enough lands that I will ideally never miss a land drop, and at the very least not miss a land drop for, say, my first turns. So that's kind of the core underlying conceit about the disagreement that we have about how many lands to play. Is I believe that the number of lands you should play is kind of a simple mathematical question that is a function of exactly two things. It's a function of when you're willing to miss your first land drop a portion of the time, and how many cards you're drawing on each turn. There are other calculations that factor in your other mana sources, and I think that that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. I think your first priority should be to make sure that you're playing a land every turn, and then once you've done that, you can decide how many additional mana sources you want and how you want to get more, like if you know whether you want to devote cards to getting more than 1 mana per turn, or whether getting 1 mana per turn is sufficient for your needs, as long as you're consistently hitting your land drops. But either you don't need more than 1 mana per turn, or you need more than 1 mana per turn. And if you don't need more than 1 mana per turn, then you don't need mana rocks, and lands are better. If you do need more than 1 mana per turn, then mana rocks help, but you should also be playing enough lands that you're never missing your land drop, because then the mana rocks aren't helping you get to more than 1 mana per turn. So I think making sure that you can hit your land drops always needs to precede deciding how many mana rocks you're going to play. Some other tweets: unless you're ramping into something that's providing resilient advantage, slow and steady is far safer. So this is about the idea that you know, there are some things that are worth ramping into where you do want to play rocks to play them earlier. Those things should be things that are resilient. So, you know, this should hedge against that thing I was talking about just like, well, I played the biggest thing, it drew the removal spell, I've used all of my cards on ramping, and I don't have anything else to do. If you play something that draws a removal spell, but it drew you a card when it entered play or something like that, then you might not care that much that it drew a removal spell and it replaced itself, and you'll just play something else after that and it'll be fine. That could certainly and very, very often will be your commander. I don't think that it's correct to round this to, well, every commander is that thing, so our commander deck should play this. I think that there are a very large number of 2 and 3 mana commanders, and that most of them don't want mana rocks. I also think that there are a lot of commanders that are in some way like lords or like want creatures in play for some reason, and in most, if not all of those decks, dragons being maybe the most likely exception, it's better to just play creatures that work with your commander rather than playing mana rocks. It's the time when I think you are most likely to want mana rocks is when your commander is expensive and wants to be the first thing that you play. So there are some commanders that want to be played first and some commanders that want to be played last. The Lords are a good example of commanders that are played last, where you want to like have a bunch of things in play that they're scaling up when you play them to get kind of a lot of impact the turn that you play them before they're answered. So I think some commanders fall in this category and some don't. The biggest point I think is that there are a lot of the two major places where people play rocks by default because they're building commander decks and that's what you do when they shouldn't, in my opinion, are 1, 2, and 3 mana commanders and tribal commanders. If you're playing a commander that costs 4 or more, that isn't that doesn't make your cheaper cards better or scale up based on your cheaper creatures, then there's a very good chance that it's correct for your deck to play some number of rocks, but you still need to be playing lands. So moving on from the tweets to kind of recommendations about numbers of lands, a lot of people cite this article by Frank Karsten about how many lands you should play. So he does kind of, a bunch of math, as he's known for, involving some kind of regression with a data set, involving number of lands, average mana value, number of cheap card draw spells, number of cheap mana ramps, presence of a companion in the sideboard. This is all based in 60 card Magic, where he's trying to optimize your ability to spend mana every turn and cast all of your spells and hit your land drops. So his recommendation for Commander for 99 card decks is a direct port of that math to 99 card format from a 60 card format, right? So he has this formula that he came up with, and he just multiplies it by 99 over 60 to get a recommendation of 31.42 plus 3.13 times the average mana value of your spells, minus 0.28 times the number of cheap card draw spells or mana ramp spells. So I think that this approach is not the right way to be thinking about lands in Commander. He's looking at the curve of your deck and your ability to cast spells, and kind of there's an assumption about the total number of spells you're trying to cast and the total length of a game that is a direct port from 2-player 60-card deck Magic that I don't think applies in Commander. In Commander, I think that card flow scales up over the course of a game because of mechanics like Parlay and the Monarch and a variety of commanders that reward the table with drawing extra cards for attacking other opponents and stuff like that. The increased card flow in a game of Commander compared to a 60-card deck means that you are both more likely to have lands to play, but also more likely to have spells to play. Also, the presence of your commander is, of course, a mana sink. It's an extra card in your hand that you cast and then likely end up casting multiple times and costs more each time, so it can eat up a lot of mana. So my belief is that most commander decks in most games can spend roughly all of their mana every turn throughout the game. And so unlike in a 6-card deck that's focused on curving out, there's never a point where you want to miss a land drop. And so well, there's never a point where you want to miss a land drop, but also there's a point where it becomes easy to make a land drop because you've drawn all these extra cards, and the game has shifted from players drawing an average of 1 card a turn to players drawing more than 1 card per turn, even without you needing to cast any card spell, just because other people have effects that are ultimately resulting in drawing more cards. And so I think that, yeah, you just want to be sure that you don't miss a land drop before that point in the game where you're kind of assured to hit your land drops. And so I acknowledge that there is that point where extra cards are drawn, and you might not need a very high land count to make your land drops on turns like 7 and 8 because you drew a bunch of extra cards on turns 5 through 6 after someone created the monarch or started using a parlay creature or something like that. That said, I don't think that the numbers people are playing get you where you need to be. Let me explain. You have a 99 card deck. So this is a hypergeometric calculator. I want to walk you through using this if you're not familiar, because I think it's pretty important for a lot of aspects of deck building. So you have a 99 card deck. You're playing, let's say, 38 hands, the high end of what I think a lot of people kind of default to. Let's look at turn 4. So on turn 1, you have 8 cards. On turn 2, you've drawn a 9th card. On turn 3, you've drawn a 10th card. On turn 4, you draw your 11th card. But let's say that you've drawn 1 additional card. I think that, card draw is plentiful in Commander, but I think that you can't really expect other people to have done something that's going to let you draw more than 1 card by your 4th turn. And a lot of the card draw that you're playing, you're not planning to play in the early turns. If you were, you wouldn't be playing Mana Rocks because really, like, if you're planning to play Mana Rock, that Mana Rock isn't drawing you cards. So you're, like, not having drawn a card until after you've played that Mana Rock. And while you can go, like, rock into card draw spell to, like, turn this, these resources that you've put into mana back into cards that you can make your land drops, my experience has been that doing that leaves you too far behind on the board, that it's better to have board presence, and that playing like expensive dedicated card draw is unnecessary because of what I was saying about the increased card flow that kind of naturally happens in the game of Commander. So anyway, my point is, I think most decks are unlikely to have drawn more than 1 extra card by turn 4. If you have a deck that definitely will have drawn more cards, then just change the sample size number to whatever sample size you think that you'll have drawn. Now, on turn 4, of course, you need to have found 4 lands. So 4 of the 12 cards that you've had need to be from among these 33 cards in your 99. So then you hit calculate, and you hope it works. Let's refresh and try again. Okay, so you're 75% to make your 4th land up if you have 38 lands in your deck, which means 25% of the time you're going to miss your 4th land drop and stick on 3. That may or may not sound tolerable to you. To me, missing a quarter of the time seems way too high. If you play 41, closer to the floor, I'd recommend. This is being really difficult. Then you get it up to 82%. So you're still like 18% to miss. Better. Still a little risky for my taste a lot of the time. 43 is closer to what I target often. That brings you down to below 15% to miss. That feels a lot better to me. Um, the counter argument is, well, but what about when you draw too many lands? And so then you have to ask, well, what is too many lands? How many lands is too many? So you have 57 spells. You've drawn the same 12 cards. How many spells do you need to have? It's turn 4, so, and you have your commander, so that's one spell that you can play. How many other spells do you need to have that you can play turn 4? If you've drawn 4 spells, then you're quite likely to well, let's assume 4 is not enough, because some of them are expensive, and you want to play spells. It's okay to not play a spell on turn 1 in a lot of commander decks, but you'd like to play spells on at least turns 2, 3, and 4. So that's 3 spells to have any chance of having done that. Realistically, let's say you need 6 spells. 6 spells to make it pretty likely that half of them were castable on turns 2, 3, and 4, and you're not flooded at this stage. You're 81% to have drawn at least 6 spells with 57 spells in your deck. I think that's not too bad. Chances of having drawn at least 5 spells, 93%. And then, of course, most of the time you'll have drawn more than that. So you can, kind of think about the curve of your deck, how likely you are to have enough plays to make in that time, and when you start drawing extra cards, and whether you're going to ever reach a point where you just don't have things to do. But I suspect if you just look at, the fail cases of maximizing your mana spent over time in a game as either being when you first miss your land drop or when you first run out of things that you can spend your mana on, I think if you just think through your games, you will likely realize that you have usually missed your first land before you've run out of things to cast. If that's the case, then you can ignore the hypergeometric calculator and just know that you should be playing more lands because you know which of the 2 poles of fail states you're running into, and you want to be, in a spot where you're running into them maybe a comparable amount, or, ideally basically never running into either one of them. So anyway, my key point here is number of mana rocks should not impact number of lands you play. Number of lands you play should simply be a function of how many cards you're drawing, with the goal of making land drop every turn, unless your deck is doing something very specific that doesn't care about missing land drops. That, like, if you're playing something like an aggressive light pause strategy, where once you have 4 lands in play, you're looking to be attacking your opponent for lethal with light pause, and all your spells cost 1 or 2, and you're going to run out of cards, and that's fine. Then you don't need more lands. But if you're trying to play typical battle cruiser type board game style longer games of Commander, I've found that the most important thing is just to make your land drops. And if you have drawn lands but not spells, and you don't end up having a spell to cast on turns 2 and 3, and you do nothing instead, I've found at most tables that the person in that spot is viewed as not very much of a threat, and they're kind of left alone until they can, get into the game. And it's much easier to be back in the game and able to, participate and significantly impact the outcome of the game if you have a bunch of lands in play and you can draw and do something powerful, rather than if you're missing land drops, and then even once you hit your land to start functioning again, you're still kind of insurmountably behind on mana. So I think games are just a lot more kind of naturally forgiving of land heavy draws than land light draws. So um, to take a more practical look at this in terms of like, so what am I really saying when I say mana rocks are overplayed? Like, which commanders should play mana rocks and which shouldn't? So I figured I would just look at the most played commanders in the last month or two or whatever this is looking at, past month, and see which of them I think probably want mana rocks and which don't. So this is a 3-mana commander. I think for the most part, if you're playing a 3-mana commander, you probably don't need mana rocks, because you don't want to like skip from 2 mana to 4 mana uh, if your commander costs 3, unless you're not planning to cast your commander until you like play it and immediately trigger it or something. There are ways to build this deck that presumably aren't as into getting the commander in play. Maybe you're just trying to like. No, I suspect that this deck doesn't want a lot of mana rocks. I suspect the things that do 1 damage are not generally very expensive. And if you're using something like Goblin Bombardment, it's good to have like cheap creatures to have to use at the bombardment and play this. I think you're generally going to be better off building a board through a natural curve than playing mana rocks with this 3-mana commander, as with most others. Jodah the Unifier. Some room for variation here. Jodah wants to be played with a lot of legends. Jodah is a lord. I think that the strongest Jodah decks are basically just looking to curve out legends, play Jodah on 5, and then the Cascade is kind of a nice bonus, but the Coat of Arms effect is your kind of immediate impact that's going to give you a ton of damage output. Especially if you've just played Legend on turn 1, Legend on turn 2, etc., rather than like ramping up to Jodah, hoping Jodah lives, and then trying to cast like more expensive legends and cascade into fewer small legends. If I were building Jodah, there are versions of it that could be fun with a few mana rocks, because this is a 5-mana commander, but I think you're like more likely to have a more competitive deck if you focus more on carving out cheap legends rather than ramping up to Jodah and then going bigger than that. The Dragon. This one, I would be surprised if it didn't want mana rocks, honestly. You're making your dragons cheaper, but your dragons are still probably mostly cards that cost 4 or more as far as like a printed mana cost. So you get to start playing them on 3. And like if you play a mana rock on turn 2, you'll probably have better options about which dragons you can cast and get closer to casting the Dragon. So this is a good example of a deck that does want rocks. Lathril, Blade of Elves. This makes elves, wants you to have a lot of elves in play. Any ramping that you're doing with this is going to be done with elves. I don't think anyone's really putting a lot of mana rocks in this kind of deck, because elves are just a better version of the same thing. Be'lakor, the Dark Master. This is an expensive flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you're drawing cards. This is another one where this is tribal, right? Like it's looking for demons. When another demon enters the battlefield, it does damage. But this is a tribal deck that is an expensive tribe where the commander wants to be in play before you play your other things, and the commander is drawing cards up front. Well, I guess the cards that it's drawing, you're drawing X cards where X is the number of demons you control. So you draw more cards if you've played demons first. So this kind of is happy to be played before or after other demons. So it wants to be played kind of like in the middle. Like you want to deploy some demons, play this, deploy some more demons. Demons are expensive. This thing is expensive. This deck wants a high land count and also mana rocks. This is a deck that I think will really suffer if you ever fail to play a land. And you want to be like getting more than 1 mana per turn on average. So another good expensive tribe lord that wants mana rocks. Atraxa. So here the main thing they're doing is proliferating. I think that it's very easy to find permanents that it is valuable to proliferate on that you can cast instead of casting mana rocks for the most part. I could see playing a couple 2 mana rocks in this deck, especially if your like budget for lands doesn't involve a bunch of like dual lands and fetch lands such that you have perfect mana for your 4-color commander. If you're playing on like a bit more of a budget mana base, then it's a lot more likely that you're going to need some 5-color mana rocks to be able to reliably cast this. But I think that, for the most part, you're looking to get permanents into play that'll scale well based on the proliferate. Marneus Calgar. So this is a 5-mana, 3/5 double strike. Whenever one more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. And then you can spend mana to make tokens. So this wants to be in a token deck, but this very much wants to be in play before the tokens. So curving out things that make tokens and then playing this, you're not actually taking advantage of what it's doing. So this is another one where you want your commander in play first. And it's a 5-mana commander. So I think that it makes sense to play rocks with Marneus. Dragonlord, another great. This is another one where it's an expensive lord that wants to be in play first. This should have mana rocks. Wilhelm the Rockcleaver, zombie tribal, and this wants you to have other zombies in play to sacrifice when you play it. This deck should not have mana rocks. There are a lot of cheap, profitable zombies that you can play and zombie synergies that you can build. If you play a rock on turn 2 to play this on turn 3, you're getting a lot less value out of this than if you'd play zombie on 2, zombie on 3. Edgar Markov. This is another one that's like a very much a lord. It costs 6. I think that mana rocks are very frequently played in Edgar Markov decks. I think that these would be better off cutting those rocks for vampires. You really want to trigger the Eminence ability a lot and just like have vampires in play. And I think that this is one that wants to be really like, you want a high land count because you definitely want to have 6 land in play on turn 6. But I think that you should be playing like as many vampires as possible instead of playing rocks, and then just having a high land count so that you can get maximum value out of all of Edgar Markov's abilities. Magus Lucia Kane. So this is a ramp creature that's looking to play extremely expensive cards. You're certainly looking to cast this before turn 4, but it's green, so you shouldn't be playing rocks. You should be playing either creatures that tap for mana or rampant growth effects. There's choice depending on what's going on with your deck. Shorikai. This is another like engine commander that doesn't really care about other things being in play before it's in play, and you just kind of want to get your commander down and start doing its thing. Your commander costs 4, so 2-mana rocks are good, 3-mana rocks are bad. You do want to, be able to cast this on turn 3 most of the time. Ishin, this is a 3-mana commander that wants other creatures in play. There should not be rocks in this deck. You just want to curve out into the sky. Prosper's tricky. Prosper only costs 4, which is the number where you could try to ramp into it or not. And then Prosper, it's alive, is netting you good extra mana from its ability. I think you could really go either way with Prosper. There are good ways to build it with or without mana rocks. Yoriko, there should be no mana rocks in this deck. Muldrotha. You could play some mana rocks for type diversity. Obviously, most of your ramp, you're going to want creature and land search. Creatures, because they're more efficient and you can get them back, and you really want that efficiency with the Muldrotha deck because you kind of want as much mana as possible. Spells, because they're a little bit more reliable in terms of, the land's not going anywhere. On the other hand, Muldrotha doesn't let you recast them, but also you're going to have enough other things Muldrotha does let you recast that it's not going to be a big problem. This is another one where I think Muldrotha is kind of default pretty threatening and default very powerful late, and kind of better the longer you wait before playing it when you have like a richer, fuller graveyard. This is a deck where I think that I would kind of not want to be in a hurry to play Muldrotha too early, and I would want to try to minimize how threatening I appeared for most of the game. So I would want to focus on just kind of playing a mid-range Sultai game, getting creatures into play, playing my game with just like the creatures that I'm casting, and then casting Muldrotha for the first time pretty late in the game. But your mileage may vary on how threatening you want to appear and what strategy you want to take with that. Korvold, Fey-Cursed King. I think that you're best off kind of mirroring some of the constructed Korvold decks in terms of having like a large board presence of like creatures and sack engines and things that are like profitable to sacrifice. I think turn 5 isn't too late to play Korvold. I think you can play some like creatures that generate mana, maybe a couple really strong rocks, especially if you're like worried about, like if you're on a budget mana base. But for the most part, I think it's better to play other cards before playing Korvold. Go Shintai of Life's Origins. This is a 5-color green card that is essentially a tribal card. Your Shrine Tribal. You should, like, I think that enough of the shrines are low cost, and again, green should be enough of your mana base that you could play a couple of you could play an Arcane Signet in this deck and it wouldn't hurt you, but for the most part, there shouldn't be very many rocks here, I think. You have better stuff to do. Kalia, mana rocks are good here for the most part. Like, you want Kalia to be down earlier, and your tribes are very expensive. Kenrith, a Kenrith deck could be whatever. It's really hard to say. Krenko, obviously, I would prefer goblins to mana rocks. Animar, you're looking for creature mana and just like creatures rather than mana rocks. Shatterfang, again, creatures rather than mana rocks if you're accelerating at all, which you don't really need to. Omnath, you're certainly looking for lands and things, put lands into play instead of rocks. Breya, Breya like is giving you value for sacrificing artifacts and cost 4. Mana rocks probably makes sense here, although I might not play mana rocks and instead play mana cantrips, like Ichor Wellspring type cards. I think there's like an interesting choice there, and that comes up with other artifact commanders also, about like whether it's better to just like play a cantrip artifact or a mana rock. And I tend to prefer the cantrip artifacts. I think that they, decrease your like the aggro that you pull, like they're less threatening, and they give you like more sustained, durable late game. So again, it's not that I'm saying decks want mana rocks, it's just that I think that many decks don't want mana rocks and very few decks don't have mana rocks. And again, I think that the most important point is just the number of lands that you're playing comes first. And then you decide how many rocks you want to play on top of that after knowing how many lands you're playing, where again, that's a function of primarily just cheap card draw. So that's it. That's my fairly long-winded explanation of where I'm coming from, what kinds of things I'm thinking about, and just diving a lot deeper into this topic than I would be able to in a Twitter thread or replies. So thanks for listening, and if you are interested in more Commander content from me, then be sure to, like, subscribe, do all that stuff that tells me that there's an audience for this kind of thing. And if you're new to my reasoning and like hearing how I think about the game, then be sure to check out some of my other limited content, especially if you're someone who also plays them. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.